I'm joined today by Marc Ruskin, who's was an FBI special agent for 27 years, working undercover, for which he was awarded 5 commendations. He's also an attorney, worked as an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn, New York, worked for U.S. Senator Daniel Moynihan, and his great new book is The Pretender: My Life Undercover for the FBI. Marc, it's so great to talk to you. I'd like to start a little bit with your background. So you're from a secular Jewish family. I'm from a secular Jewish family. I can tell you, if I had told my secular Jewish family I was joining the FBI, I don't think it would have been particularly thrilling for them. I mean, what was that like within your family?
Well, I have to say that the reaction was not exactly an outpouring of joy from my parents. My father was a physician who's now deceased, and his father was a physician. And in the family, the tradition was to go into medicine. I did second best, which was to go into law school for those who couldn't quite cut it to become a doctor. And the pattern my parents envisioned for me, of course, was to, start, work maybe in public service as a prosecutor or defense lawyer for a few years, then go to work for a law firm and have a nice, quiet, safe job in a prestigious law firm. So when I deviated is almost too mild a term, when I chucked that out the window, basically, in order to join the FBI, which was anathema, as you know, to many Jews, especially secular Jews in the 50s and 60s, it wasn't particularly well received. Ultimately, though, they came around and came to respect my choice and what I was doing, to protect America and also to protect civil rights, which was one of their big concerns.
What is the precursor to sort of like full-blown undercover work? I interviewed, and I know you know him, Chris Voss, a couple of months ago, who
Sure,
was at
sure.
one point, a big-time negotiator within the FBI.
Right,
And he
right.
talked about he was working at a suicide hotline part-time while a special agent, and eventually was able to use that to transition into negotiations. What's sort of the precursor for undercover work?
Well, first I'll mention with regard to Chris, as you recall from the book, when I went to Asuncion in Paraguay to rescue the former Miss Paraguay who'd been kidnapped, Chris Voss, the expert on kidnapping, was my lifeline from Quantico, who provided invaluable advice when we ultimately did save her. In terms of the precursor to doing undercover work, one of the things which was very helpful to me is when I was an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn prior to becoming an FBI agent, I worked in their investigations bureau for about a year and conducted literally hundreds of interrogations of people who had committed murders, all kinds of heinous crimes. And I think, developed an expertise in learning when I'm being lied to and being able to detect the subtle signs of being lied to, and also in developing rapport. I mean, trying to get people who had committed these terrible crimes to tell me about their crimes, essentially tell me things which were against their interest. I had to learn how to push the right buttons and quickly develop a rapport. And these are skills which were invaluable to me as an undercover agent. Learning to push the right buttons to get people to trust me and to confide in me was really key to being able to be successful as a UC, as well as being able to tell when people were lying to me. Because a good criminal, which is what I was pretending to be, has to have a sense of when he or she is being lied to.
Talk a little bit about the sort of creation of the identities that you assume. There's a term called backstopping, which you talk about in the book. It would be great if you could tell us a little bit of what backstopping is, what goes into it, but also how many people within the FBI are aware of any particular identity that you are assuming for an operation.
Generally speaking, the only people who would be aware of my fictitious identity, we call it AFID, which is alias and false ID. So the acronym is AFID. The only people who would be aware of my AFID would be the UC team, the team that was supporting me. That normally there'll be a case agent, sometimes 2 case agents, a financial analyst, some other agents occasionally lending support in a surveillance capacity. But other than this intimate small group, no one else would know about the false ID. The concept of backstopping is very different in real life than what one imagines, what one sees in the films and on television. On the TV screen, the supervisor hands the undercover agent a wallet and says, "Okay, Mark, here's your new ID. You're now David Pakman, and your birthday is such and such, and so memorize all the details and go out and do it." In real life, it's just the opposite. Creating a fictitious ID is a painstaking job, often taking as much as 6 months, because one has to create an ID which is verifiable. So everything that you are going to be telling people or writing down has to be something that if someone looks to check it out, that they can confirm that it really happened. So in one of my cases, one of my first deep cover cases, which was Comcor, an investigation into corruption and fraud on Wall Street, I developed an ID which had me as having lived in Puerto Rico for many years. I'm a native Argentine, as you mentioned. I speak Spanish fluently. So we worked, and I've lived in Puerto Rico and worked there. So we worked that into my background. And what I had to do was traveled to Puerto Rico and met with individuals who would later be able to verify that I was their tenant. So for example, someone who owned several condominiums agreed to be my quote unquote landlord. And we actually looked at apartments. He had the dates. He created a fictitious file that he could refer to. So later on, he could say that, and the name I was using was H. Marc Renard. That H. Marc Renard, yes, he was my tenant. He lived in one of my apartments from this year to that year and so forth. And I also met with a small businessman who agreed to vouch as my employer so that I could list him as a prior employment.
And how much do you tell them, Mark, about what you're doing? In other words, do you tell them just the bare minimum? Do they understand that this is an identity that's required for an FBI operation?
Yeah, these are usually individuals which we refer to as friends of the Bureau. These are civilians who are sympathetic to the mission of the Bureau, to fighting organized crime, to fighting fraud, and fighting terrorism, and are willing to pitch in and to lend a hand in order to make our endeavors successful. And without the friends of the Bureau, it would be a tough job indeed. All they would know is that it's an undercover case. You know, we would approach them. Some of these individuals are approached by me personally, others by intermediaries. And all that they would be told is, Mark, and they may not even know my true name, that we have an undercover. He needs a fictitious landlord or employer. Can you help us out? And that would be it. That would be all they would know. Because the less they know, the less that they can inadvertently leak out and potentially damage the operation.
So continuing down the line, you get the fictitious ID developed and backstopped. How do you develop the look for an undercover identity? And in the book, you talk about, playing a, quote, Hispanic guy, French as well. You were born in France, for people who don't know, Italian in other operations. How do you start to develop the physical appearance?
Well, in the preparation for the case, I mean, as I mentioned, the backstopping would take about 6 months. And the other phases, which were going on simultaneously, the case agent would be drafting an undercover proposal. That's literally a book-sized document that had to be approved at FBI headquarters. So while all that's going on, I'm essentially studying the crime problem and studying the individuals, learning as much as I can about them, the ones who are going to be the targets of the investigation. And based on what I learn about them, I try to develop a persona that is going to be someone they can relate to. So if it's a case like Run DMV, which was a case, a long-term 2.5-year undercover Group 1, we call it Group 1, which is a major undercover operation, lasted 2.5 years, I knew it was going to be street-level type people. It would be the intermediaries who obtain fraudulent documentation for terrorists, mafiosis, fugitives, or people who also sell drugs. They also sell guns, stolen cars. It's essentially almost what we consider organized street crime, or like a level above street criminal. So I had to develop a persona that they could relate to. In that case, it was Alex Perez, a fugitive from Miami, Florida. So I grew a ponytail. I had a ponytail halfway down my back. You wouldn't be able to tell from my hair today, but in those days I could do that. And I wore 3 or 4 gold chains around my neck, 3 or 4 gold chains around my wrist, courtesy of the FBI's seized property unit. These were chains which had been seized from drug dealers and so forth. My car had a late model Mercedes or other high-end cars, had Miami Metro-Dade license plates, which in those, Miami at the time was the capital of cocaine. And my car, even though it had Florida plates, had never been south of Brooklyn. But I would show up for meets in this case, and the car with the Florida plates would announce that this was some guy, from the cocaine capital.
Sure.
And I'd get out of the car with my ponytail, with my bling, with some gel in my hair, my shirt unbuttoned nearly down to my navel. And that would send signals to the subjects so that even before I opened my mouth, they were already 90% convinced that I was some kind of shady character that they could trust, basically.
How much contact do you have with your family and friends during deep cover work? I recently, in addition to reading your book to prepare for our interview, I read Donnie Brasco by Joseph Pistone. And he had incredibly limited contact with his family during his 6 years operation. What about you?
Well, Joe Pistone, I read Donnie Brasco the way other people would read a textbook in professional school. When I was starting to do UC work, there was no training, there was no schools, and the only way to learn, basically, other than doing it, was to read the memoirs of other agents, and his was one of the major books I read. I mean, reading Donnie Brasco for me was a big learning experience and assisted me greatly in terms of how learning how to be a UC. And I'll also mention that Joe Pistone did a blurb for my book, which is and I had the opportunity to work with him a couple of times over the years. But as far as seeing family is concerned, there are different degrees, and this doesn't come across in the movies too much. There are different degrees of deep cover. So my first case, Comcar, I've referred to earlier, the white collar case, was a really deep cover. I mean, I was doing that one 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I had an apartment I lived in. I had a car with a garage. I had my job as a crooked broker that I went to every day. And in that case, I did have very limited contact with my family. And that was and with friends, and that was a great strain. But other cases, which are deep cover, don't involve necessarily 7 days a week. In Run DMV, I would generally go home at night. But what I would do before my own real home, not some fictitious undercover home, but what I would do is I would dry clean on the way home. And the dry cleaning is a tradecraft term, which involves taking certain measures to make sure you're not being followed. So I'd get into my undercover car, get on the highway, drive a bit at a regular speed limit speed, then let's say slow down to 30 miles per hour in the right lane and see if anybody else is slowing down. Or I would get off at an exit. But when I get off at an exit, I go down 30 yards and pull off to the shoulder. See who else is getting off at that exit, wait 5 minutes, put my car into reverse, and back up, get back on the highway, and drive on. Anybody who's been following me now has lost me. Also going through stop signs, making U-turns, illegal U-turns, little things like that. Once I'd be comfortable knowing that there was no one on my tail, then I could go home. So in cases like that, I was still able to maintain a relationship with family and friends. And even though they were deep cover operations, as far as concealing my residence from their subjects, that's normal. When I'm acting like a criminal, which I have to do to be persuasive, to gain the confidence of criminals, I have to act the way they do. They're not advertising to me where they live.
Sure.
I mean, they don't want me to know where they live, because if I get busted, I can call, and I'm a real criminal, I'm more than likely than not to cough him up. Say, yeah, go. Give me a break, and I'll tell you where this guy lives and what he's involved in. So it's very natural for criminals to conceal a lot of personal data from each other, and for me to conceal my residence, facts about my personal life from other criminals. All it did was enhance my credibility. It certainly didn't make him suspicious in the least.
We're speaking with former FBI Special Agent Marc Ruskin. The book is The Pretender, My Life Undercover for the FBI. We will pause and continue with Marc on tomorrow's program. We're continuing our conversation with Marc Ruskin. He's a former FBI Special Agent for 27 years, worked undercover in a number of different operations. His book is The Pretender, My Life Undercover for the FBI. So picking up sort of where we left off, I'd love to dig into, in the book you mentioned, and you sort of mentioned it in the first part of the interview, good versus bad questions when you are wearing a wire, as it's called, and trying to elicit incriminating statements from subjects. Can you give us some examples of good and bad questions or way to handle conversations?
Well, I'll tell you about what bad questions are like. Bad questions are the ones that the prosecutors, the U.S. attorneys, ask you to ask at the next meeting. We have meetings with the case agent and the prosecutor, and the prosecutor would say to me, Mark, look, next time you meet with Jose, ask him where he got the guns, or ask him where he got the cocaine. And basically, the bad questions are the questions that make you look like a cop. A real criminal, and to be a successful UC, you have to be able to think and behave like a real criminal. A real criminal has three things in his mind, or her mind, basically. One is to make money. One is to not get arrested, or two is not to get arrested, and three is to not get hurt, or not to get injured. So if I'm acting with these three principles in mind, and I'm meeting with some other bad guy, I'm thinking I don't want to get arrested. I'm not going to ask him questions, or I expect him to ask me questions, which are going to give up information about myself, which would hink him up. So I'm not going to ask him things that I don't need to know. So if I'm buying cocaine, why do I need to know where he got the cocaine? All I'm going to care about is that the cocaine is good quality, and that I'm getting a good price for it, and I'm going to make a lot of money selling it. Anything else that I ask about is going to set off alarm bells in the back of the guy's mind. What I have to do, if I want that kind of information, is I have to develop enough rapport so that eventually the subject is going to volunteer the information. We do small talk, we chat, we'll have a bite to eat, maybe after a buy or something like that, and then slowly elicit the information, but in such a way that it doesn't look like I'm asking. So in such a way that it maybe flatter the person, like, hey, this is really great cocaine. I've never seen such pure stuff. And then the guy feels flattered, right? So he's going to, oh, well, I was able to bring it in from Malaysia or whatever, and starts to volunteer because he's bragging about the information. But that's how you do it. You have to be very subtle. If you look like you're being nosy and asking for things you don't need to know, you're just going to either get the door shut in your face or, God forbid, worse at the next meeting.
And Mark, when it comes to some of these meetings and buys, I mean, you describe in the book one situation where someone you were with sort of froze and said you were Colombian, right? And that wasn't part of the backstory that you had agreed upon. How do the sort of different, you talked about Argentina, Puerto Rico, and Colombia, three very different versions of Spanish or accents that are spoken in those three places. How did you manage that? And wasn't there a risk of someone sort of being a little bit curious as to why your accent didn't match the place you were supposedly from?
Well, I was very careful in terms of using judgment in terms of telling people where I was from based on their own personal ethnicity. So in the Run DMV case, I was dealing with a lot of Dominicans and Puerto Ricans. And with them, I told them I was a Cuban from Miami because they wouldn't know a Cuban accent from a Venezuelan accent, from any other accent. And it worked fine. When I was dealing with real Cubans, I would, of course, never tell them I was Cuban because they would, in a heartbeat, know that I wasn't. And in their cases, I would just say I was from Buenos Aires. I was from Argentina. But I wanted it to fit the story. And I'll tell you one amusing note was with a coyote, a fellow who used to smuggle people across the border. And in New York, he specialized in immigration documents. And he's one of the characters in the book. And I was having a meet with him downtown in Manhattan once. I was posing as a Colombian fugitive who was trying to, who was illegally in the United States, and I needed to get a green card. And for $15,000, he was obtaining a green card for me. And it involved various visits to immigration downtown. And at one meeting across from the Federal Building, he gets into my undercover car, which was a red Jeep Cherokee at the time. And he says to me, he goes, in Spanish, we're talking Spanish, and he goes, for a guy from Venezuela, from Colombia rather, why is it that you speak with a French accent? And he picked up. He was the first one in years who had ever picked up on the accent, because since I'm a native French speaker, as you pointed out, my accent in Spanish is a bit French. My R's are French, and I was like taken aback. And I had Alice, my undercover girlfriend, in the back, and she kind of froze. And then I thought to myself, well, sometimes the big lie is the lie that works the best. So I tell them, listen, I don't tell a lot of people about this, but when I was 18, I got into a big jam in Colombia, and it was the kind of thing that could easily have gotten me killed, and there was no one I could go to because all the bad people, the different gangs were after me, the police were after me. So what I did is I went to Europe, I escaped to Europe and joined the French Foreign Legion.
Right.
Now that to me seemed like totally ridiculous, incredible story. And I said to him, after 10 years, the accent just rubbed off on me. And then we had our meeting. He got out of the car, and afterwards I'm driving off with Alice, and I'm saying, I wonder if he's ever going to meet with us again. That was the most preposterous thing I've ever said. 2 weeks later, we have another meeting. He jumps back into my car. Everything is fine, and he says to me, he goes, "Hey, I saw some of your friends on TV the other day." So some of my friends, I have no idea what the hell he's talking about. Some of my friends on TV. I said, "Oh, really? Who's that?" He goes, "Over in Desert Storm, over in Iraq, they were showing on the news a bunch of French Foreign Legion soldiers getting off a plane." I said, "Oh, okay, that's it. Well, yeah."
Right.
A lot of my buddies are in Iraq now. Boy, am I glad I'm not with them now. I wouldn't want to be in that hellhole, that's for sure. And we were fine. We were friends. So it worked. It showed me that sometimes the bigger the whopper, the bigger the lie, the more likely it is to be swallowed.
And speaking of the French stuff, there was a moment where you were sort of angling for a position in Paris. And someone in the FBI who also wanted that position sort of cast doubt as to your loyalty to the United States based on your French background and desire to maybe one day retire in Paris. Now, you were ultimately sort of cleared, I guess the term would be, but are those types of loyalty doubts ever 100% resolved in the FBI? Or once you're sort of tagged with that, it can only ever be 99% resolved?
I mean, in my case, I don't think it was ever really 100% resolved, in that the security division had reached such a level of power. What happened was, after the Hansen case, this was the case where Robert Hansen was uncovered. He was a mid-level FBI management official who was found to have been a Russian spy.
Right, and actually Eric O'Neill, the FBI agent who was brought in to sort of prove the case, we interviewed him years ago, and he was played by Ryan Phillippe in the movie on the subject.
And it was a very good movie, but he did a lot of damage. But some of the collateral damage he did is that he created this. He was the origin of what became an environment of some paranoia in the bureau. The security division, which has always been in the past kind of like a backwater division that only I don't want to disparage them, but that first-class agents, let's say, would not be seen working in. All of a sudden now they attained a power that they never had before, because everyone was worried that there were spies all over the place. And So you had these agents, some of whom had very little field experience, making these important decisions about people's careers. And when I had applied for the Paris post, as you mentioned, and I was actually awarded the Paris post, I was assigned to be working at the embassy, U.S. embassy in Paris, because of this anonymous letter. And it turned out I found out who wrote it, putting my loyalties into question. For several months, the position was held up, and ultimately I was not sent to Paris. And I was basically told, you're never going to Paris. I was offered the position in Buenos Aires, and they said, look, you can take this or leave it, but this is all the best that you're going to get, which was pretty good. So I was happy to get that. But the shadow, I think, persisted until I retired, especially since they found out at that point. I don't think they realized I was a dual national. But once the security division found out that I actually had both French and U.S. nationality, then they really got a bug up there, you know where.
Last thing I want to touch on, Marc, in the limited time we have left. So you are retired now. How much do you worry about people looking for you, coming after you, people from operations, people that maybe did time in prison but have gotten out or are scheduled to get out? How much do you worry about that?
I think for the most part, a lot of them were professionals and felt, and I got the impression after the arrest that their attitude was, we were doing our job, you were doing your job, nothing personal. Some of the others, even if they may not look at it from such a aloof point of view, at least they realized that were they to take some action against an FBI agent, that it would essentially be like the sky falling on their heads. They would have the weight of the entire FBI on top of them because the FBI protects its own. So now most of these people are middle-aged or older. Are they really going to want to invite a life of hiding essentially for the rest of their lives to have so that goes into the calculation as well. And the ones who are really wacky or crazy, and I'm sure you remember, you can probably guess who I'm talking about from the book, not using their true names in the book and kind of disguising the facts a little bit so that they would not be readily identifiable.
Yeah. And
for the most part, they're not the kind of people who browse at Barnes and Nobles, looking in the illiterate nonfiction section.
I gotcha. I will tell you once again, the book is The Pretender, My Life Undercover for the FBI. I highly recommend the book, and we've been speaking with the book's author, Marc Ruskin, today. Marc, really a pleasure speaking to you, and I appreciate your time.
David, thank you very much for inviting me.